Hello, and welcome to our webinar going over some of the cloud best practice considerations for you and your company.
Good afternoon, Kev, and thank you for having me on. My name is Anthony Rivera. I'm the Chief Information Officer here at Access Point. My background is about 23 years, started out on the IT side of the house, transitioned to security probably about 15 years or so ago, and have experience in various different cloud models, cloud deployments, different industries as well, and regulatory commitments. Excited to be here and kind of talk through a very important topic today.
And my name is Kevin Hartwig. I started out more on the software engineering side and working on various projects to move companies onto the cloud. I kind of got that little bit of a urge to become a site reliability engineer and been working on that for the past 10 years and working with companies of various sizes, as startups to government and things like that. Today, we're going to go over some cloud best practice models. Here are 6 areas that we're going to focus on as part of that. The first being the shared responsibility model, a well-architected framework, infrastructure as a code, disaster recovery, cloud optimization, and compliance in government.
Yeah, so starting out, Kevin, we have shared responsibility model, and I think this is a great place to begin because this is an area that a lot of people can get themselves quickly into trouble with the cloud, right? When they don't understand particularly what's the provider's area of responsibility versus their own. A great example of this is something like Microsoft 365, where a lot of people use Microsoft 365 for their email. And they're thinking, hey, Microsoft's got me covered. And to an extent, Microsoft does, especially with high availability, keeping that email up. But one thing that they don't do is they don't actually back up the email. So if you had a disgruntled employee and they left and deleted their mailbox on the way out, or you got hit with something like a ransomware attack, right? You can really quickly get yourself into trouble if you don't understand the responsibility. And obviously it differs depending on the platform that you're in and how that responsibility matrix plays out. But I think that this is something that a lot of people don't pay enough attention to, in particular at the start of their cloud journey. But definitely would like your input, Kev.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Microsoft 365 is a great example. It's more of a SaaS product, but you still have some responsibilities there about after you put the data onto the system, you need to make sure that you back up that data. They're providing you a service, but you ultimately need to understand what you're putting onto it, what controls, what security you need to have in place to make sure that your data is safe. And this just continues up the chain as you're talking about a more of a platform as a service model like Heroku or Aptable, where you're running your services in their platform. Ultimately, they're responsible for the infrastructure behind those services, and they provide a lot of nice features. But you have to think about like how many instances of the servers I need to run, where my data is being stored, is my data encrypted, and things like that. And then all the way up the chain to more of an infrastructure as a service model, such as AWS or Microsoft Azure or something like that, where you're kind of in control of most everything. They provide a secure environment for you to build your platform on, but ultimately you need to make sure that your data is encrypted, all your networks set up, make sure your users are set up in a secure way where they use the least privilege principle and things like that. So
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
one of the great ways to think about this is actually using this next diagram, the shared responsibility matrix. This is really handy when you're looking at your cloud journey and trying to decide between what level on that journey you'd like to be at. SaaS is obviously, as shown here, you have the least amount of responsibility, and then it kind of just walks you through the process as you go from a SaaS to a PaaS to infrastructure as a service. And ultimately, if you're starting as an on-premise, you're kind of used to having all that responsibility. So it can also be used as a way to say, if I move from an on-premise to a platform as a service, here's some ways that I could potentially save on my investment.
Yep. And I think also one other thing that I'm going to highlight here is it also tells you what you can't do per se, right? So, when companies think about penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, things like that, every provider, and depending on that level of service that you're subscribing to is going to have those controls. So it's a really important starting point for people to just understand roles, responsibilities, and make sure that you're looking at it for every one of your providers and types of services that you're subscribing to.
Think shared responsibility model also kind of leads well into the well-architected framework. They're very similar. The difference between them is kind of that the well-architected framework talks about how you build services on the platform that you're doing, some of the best practice considerations that you need to think about before you deploy your services or your data or anything like that. And really, it's just a great way to, based off your needs, understand what the service provider expects from you. So, Anthony, I know you've done quite a bit of stuff in the cloud. What is your opinion on the well-architected framework and how it
Yeah,
meets your needs?
I'm a big proponent of it, Kevin. I think that this is, I like to use the term prescriptive, right? Because this is a prescriptive best practice to get you started, right? And again, depending on the cloud that you're using and how you're operating in it and what you're using it to do, this just gives you that really solid foundation to build out. And I think we both have seen instances where, you kind of get started in the cloud and then it evolves into something, and then trying to go back and retrofit to meet this framework is a lot harder. So taking the time to do it right, or, understand this and bring these principles in from the start is going to save you time. It's going to save you frustration, because it's a lot harder to retrofit anything after it's well established, because now you're dealing with, hey, well, I don't want to take this down. I don't want to rebuild it. Do I do a lift and shift, which we've both been involved with in aspects of our career? So it's always more costly and harder to do when, a lot of providers already have this guidance on how to get it out, from the onset.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out that both the shared responsibility model and the well-architected framework may differ a little bit between each of the providers you choose, but most every cloud provider will have a best practice for how you should implement services on their platform. And I think that's the first place every company should start when they're looking at their cloud journey is what are my needs? What does the cloud provider say we should do when we're trying to build something of that nature? And then from there.
Absolutely, I would agree. Infrastructure as code. So this is another great topic, and I think some people are intimidated off the cuff with infrastructure as code, because it's something that is it's outside of the standard. Hey, I'm going to go run to the GUI and I'm going to turn a whole bunch of knobs and levers, right? And as well as anybody, Kevin, having your background as an SRE ties very heavily to infrastructure as code. But when we look at the positives of what infrastructure as code brings us, it's a very easy, organized way to build, to deploy environments, to have, that like for like type of quickly spin up an environment, whether it's a production, a test environment, a DR environment. We're human beings, we're susceptible to making mistakes. And, the infrastructure as code approach really helps remove that, because you're treating it more like a code base that you can have several people review, peer review, right? You can have gates in terms of, making sure that changes don't have a negative impact, as opposed to somebody just going in and inadvertently clicking something. And, again, that repeatability there is just so easy. And then what I love about it most is, from an audit and compliance perspective, right? Being able to show clear delineation plans of, hey, this is what's going to be executed. This is how we do it. This is our approach to making changes to the environment. It makes that audit perspective a lot easier, in my opinion, than just trying to say, well, yeah, this is our operational plan and this is how we go into it. But, I'm preaching to the choir. I know you have a lot more experience on it.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for people to understand here is basically infrastructure as code takes your infrastructure planning and makes it something that you can generate a YAML construction file for. So you're basically taking all of your internal infrastructure, making it into a set of commands. You're going to be able to set it up so that the configuration is all done in there. Everything you need to know about your infrastructure is going to be potentially in your source code repository, which is really handy. There's a few major players in this space. Terraform and OpenTofu, which is a spinoff of Terraform, are kind of these independent infrastructures and code platforms. Most every major cloud provider and a lot of cloud service providers also have Terraform libraries that you can use to express your infrastructure in their environments. And then you have the more standard ones that AWS and Azure and Google provide, which are a little bit more proprietary. Ultimately, infrastructure as code has become kind of the best practice for the SRE space and DevOps and infrastructure in general. It allows you to, as Anthony mentioned, check in all of your infrastructure to a source code repository, allows you to do plans on that, allows you to get approvals for any changes for your infrastructure, and allows you to tie that back to any kind of ticketing system you have as well. And then the big one is that, once you build a library once, you can reuse that multiple times and you'll get the same artifact out of it at the end point, which is just huge. I couldn't do my job as well as I do without infrastructure as code, and it's kind of a daily task for me. So
And
I
I
think this
think,
is something, yeah,
I'm sorry, Kev, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to say, I think that, for the audience, right, depending on where you are in the size, obviously infrastructure as code is not going to fit an SMB where maybe you have, one IT staff, but if you have an IT outsourced provider, or you have multiple staff, making that investment into, at least looking at what infrastructure as code can do for you, or asking your provider about it, right, is a great step. And, I mean, you know as well as I do, there's a ton of good that can come from it. And yeah, granted, everybody's at different levels of maturity, but I think, the direction of the industry is leaning more towards this versus, let me go in there and start turning knobs and levers in a GUI.
yeah, I agree.
Awesome.
All right, disaster recovery and backup. Obviously, I think this is front and center for every company. Is what do you do if you have an outage or you have a data loss or something else that you need to make sure that you're planning for. So this is very important. And most companies have service level agreements with their customers that need to be met. Understanding how you can go and meet those from a data backup and recovery as it relates to recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives is very important. Not only that, but just how do you automate your backups so that it becomes second nature that you're backing up all of your systems. And ultimately, backups can be difficult in some providers, but there are tools and there are services that can help you automate those outside of the provider themselves. And I know, Anthony, this one is probably front and center in your mind as a
Yeah.
CIO. Can you talk a little bit about some of the data backup and recovery that you've handled?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think part of the allure with cloud is that, hey, it's somebody else's problem, right? They're taking care of that. And to an extent, yes, there's definitely layers of availability in the cloud, and it's going to be, highly available and redundant. But to your point, Kevin, check what your SLAs are for the service, right? Not everything's operating at 5 nines. Building in redundancy into your platform so that you have that resiliency is key, but also, looking at it from a perspective of, okay, if I'm in, one availability zone or region, what's my layer of protection? Do I need to account for having, cross-regional data backup recovery? Obviously, there's expenses to that. Not all regions are priced the same way. So all important considerations, do I have that backup? Do I need a multi-cloud backup, right? If I'm primarily in, Microsoft, should I be moving that out to something like an Amazon? And, those are conversations that we here at Access Point have had with our own data sets. So, we're kind of practicing what we preach here, making sure that you're testing those backups, right? The time to test your backup is when you're not having a disaster or an incident, right? When you have that, it's already too late. You have to be able to recover to your RPOs and RTOs as you indicated. And I would say one of the biggest things is that it's not just an IT problem, right? Disaster recovery, backup, business continuity is a business level problem. So yes, from a technology standpoint, it might be an IT and security function, but you need to have those conversations at the higher level of the business to understand what's the maximum amount of downtime, what's the risk that we can accept. what, from a contractual perspective, are we obligated to provide our customers, and start working backward from there. And again, we could probably spend a whole, webinar on this. So I'm going to kind of limit myself, but these are more conversational questions that you should be asking yourself and your team as you kind of think through this.
Agree.
Cost optimization. Yeah, this is another really important factor because, again, I think, I've seen it, and I'm sure, Kevin, you've seen it, where you get into the cloud, everything's great. It's, I'm looking at all these different tools and widgets, and then you quickly scale out an environment to, tenfold of what you initially planned. And now, the finance department's coming after you going, hey, what are we going to do? How are you going to pay for all of this? Right. So, I know, working with you in the past, we've been able to kind of start that off on the right foot by setting, alarms and looking at that from a more strategic perspective. But this is another area that can get out of hand very quickly. So I think, maybe, Kevin, if you want to cover some of the areas that you've or tools that you've implemented, might be really appropriate.
Yeah, I think the big one you touched on there is budget alarms. I think every company that I've worked at where we've made a cloud migration or just expanded our cloud usage, we've hit points where we spent much more than we expected to spend. Most of the cloud providers, I should probably just say all, allow you to set up budget alarms to basically track your spend. And I suggest kind of setting them at the 85% to 90% threshold of what you're expecting, so you can kind of understand where at in the month you're hitting those targets. And that can better let you understand like what your total spend is going to be. Most of the cloud providers have kind of cloud cost calculators that you can use, but as good as those are, there are a number of more hidden costs that you're always going to hit. Data transfer rates that you probably are going to have trouble predicting. Long-term storage. Like everybody looks at like how much I'm storing per month, but how much does that cost over time to store that same data? And there's ways you can handle that. So one of the things you can look at tiering of data. Most cloud providers have the ability to have warm and cold and other tiers of data, and they have different cost considerations to each of them. So looking at how you use your data, how often you need to access your data can really help you save some money there.
Yeah.
Put a few items in here, such as spending plans and reservations and reserved instances. That's another great way. If you know you're going to have a certain level of spend with the cloud provider, most of them will let you pay an upfront reduced cost for that same amount of spend. That's a huge thing. Usually it's around 70% of what you would normally pay.
Yeah.
Anything else you can think of? Love this one.
I would just say, holistically look at it, right? Because while every provider is going to have their different calculators and tools, you have to look at it holistically, right? If you're a cloud first company or you're using a hybrid cloud, you hit it right on the head, Kevin. What if you have, data transfer rates, right? What if I'm using a SIM tool that's in the cloud and I'm pumping it all of my telemetry from, my cloud provider, whether it's AWS or Azure or Google, to that SIM, right? Where you're paying transactionally, right? What if you're using APIs and other things and other monitoring tools, right? I mean, this is definitely a big rabbit hole that companies can go into. There's a whole business around cost optimization. I mean, this is something that we help our clients do as well. So, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. I think, to your point, being very smart and calculated about how you're going to set it up and what alarms and thresholds you're going to put is a great way to keep it under, control, but also think holistically across your enterprise and across your platform.
Clients and governance. If you're moving into the cloud, this is probably going to be one of your biggest considerations. When you have your services and data in a data center that you own, you control so much of that. And it's a little scary sometimes for people to put that same safety level into the cloud. But there's a number of techniques you can look at when you're going into this. One of the biggest ones is data encryption. Make sure you're encrypting your data in flight and at rest. Do regular risk assessments of your cloud approach. make sure that you have implemented those things that you knew were important. Uh, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, but I mean, ultimately understanding your data and your business space and everything else, what regulatory and
Yeah.
compliance concerns do you have? And we can jump all the way back to the well-architected framework where, most cloud providers will tell you exactly how or help you build out a completely compliant and something that meets your governance needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, all clouds are different, right? All platforms and you could be in a FedRAMP environment where you might have certain providers that have certain capabilities that meet that standard or HIPAA high trust, depending on what, your regulatory and industry needs are. So making sure that you're building that out, are you posturing your environment towards those, HIPAA high trust requirements, right? I mean, there's built-in tooling, there's a number of different vendors in the space that help you specialize in that to ensure that your policies, your storage levels, all of that kind of aligns to the appropriate governance and regulatory needs and controls. I think you touched on encryption, Kevin. Huge issue in the cloud. I mean, do you bring your own key? Do you, use what you have from the provider? And a lot of those questions are going to be dictated on, how big your organization is, right? How much control do you have? Do you have the skill set and expertise to do that? Are you relying on a provider to help you make those decisions? They all have different implications. And I think we could spend probably 2 hours and not even scratch the surface on this topic, but, making sure that you are having these discussions before you get too deep into it, right, is key. And again, from a cost savings, from a business perspective, right, even a risk perspective of the business, ensuring that you have this adequately accounted for, can really, help you be at an advantage versus finding out the hard way that, hey, our environment doesn't meet our requirements from a regulatory perspective, and now we got to go back and retrofit it or introduce more cost or, rebuild the environment at worst case. So, yeah, I think, that kind of covers it, but anything else there, Kevin, that I might have missed?
I think the biggest thing you said at the end is, and what I want most people to get out of this webinar is that pre-planning some of this is going to save you a lot of headache and potentially money down the road.
Yeah,
You're always going to have to make some changes as you go through a process, but it's better to understand why you made decisions rather than just jump into something and then have to redo everything at the end of it.
100%. Yeah, I would agree.
All right. So to do a quick recap, and as I just mentioned, a lot of this is just understanding what you need to think about as you move into the cloud. So we covered some of the best practice concepts here. We're going to have a lot more discussions on these same topics moving forward. We talked a little bit about some of the tools and strategies you can use to improve your cloud posture, and then ultimately some common cloud pain points to review for your business. As I said, look forward to some other webinars that we're putting out here, expanding on some of these cloud best practices. We have a list here that you can look at. And other than that, thank you all for your time. And if you have any questions, reach out to Anthony or I through our email, or if you're interested about what Access Point Consulting can help you with for your business, please go to accesspointconsulting.com. Thank you.